I'm just going to delay starting this for about a minute in case other people are struggling to get online. So I'll give people another minute. It does look like we are getting a few people joining us. So like I say, I'll just leave it until 2 minutes past and then we'll start, if that's okay, everyone. Right. Well, I think we will start now, if that sounds sensible to everybody. Although it does look like people are still joining us, but I'm sure it'll be fine. If we could go to the welcome slide. So the first one, just a bit of housekeeping to start us off with, which is following welcoming you. I just wanted to warn you that we are recording this meeting. I just wanted to check that you all know that. We thought that if we record this, we'll be able to use it potentially to share with others who haven't been able to join us this afternoon. Can you make sure that you turn your cameras off just while we're doing the presentations? Obviously, when you are doing a presentation, please turn the camera back on, obviously, if you're doing a presentation. Please feel free to ask any questions throughout the event, preferably on the chat. So in the there's a little round bubble at the top of the screen which has lines in it. So if you could put your questions on that and your names on them. And then if you want to ask the same question, could you just like the question that's been asked so that we can see what are the most popular of these questions that we can have an opportunity to talk through at the end of the session, at the question and answers session. If you're on the phone though, we'll give you an option to ask us your questions in a different way, obviously, because you can't get into the chat. Please let us know if you're having any problems with the event technically, and we'll try and again, just put it in the chat if you can, or email us. Probably best to email Laura Pope if there are any particular technical issues you've got, and she'll try and resolve it. She's nodding helpfully, so that's hopeful. And like I say, we'll if you can thumbs up any questions that you also would like answered that pop up on the chat, then that gives us an idea of how many people are interested in what things, really. So this is really a very short, I know 2 hours will go, I think will go very fast, opportunity really to reflect on all the hard work that Through the Gate teams have done, and homelessness prevention teams and community offender managers and other prison staff have done during the pandemic to prepare people for release and then to help them once they've been released from prison. We want to reflect on that hard work. We'd like to reflect a bit on the changes in practice that you've put in place and that have emerged during a pandemic. People say that necessity is the mother of invention, and there have been a huge amount of innovations brought in during this period of time. There's been creations of new partnerships, homelessness prevention teams, or task forces. I never know whether they're teams or task forces, but are a good example of cross-working between CRCs and NPS and others. And Jeanette will talk a bit more about what that work has consisted of. We also wanted to just reflect on some of the lessons that we've learned and what we've done to build on the learning that when things haven't gone quite so well, and why they haven't gone so well, and whether we can avoid those things going wrong in the future. We've got a couple of really good best practice examples that we want to talk you through. We realise that these are the tip of the iceberg, that there have been many examples of good practice. We've put some of those examples into the Through the Gate newsletters over the last 12 months, just to identify and to give people ideas of what can be done. But we know that again, those examples are only a very small amount of what has actually been done. So this is a big thank you to all of you who've worked so hard throughout the whole year, and continue to work hard to make sure that prisoners help and are helped, and before they're released and just after release from custody. So could we go on to the next slide, please? So I thought it would be worth just starting with a very quick rundown about some of the work we've done from the centre to help support the work that's been done on the ground. We created something called an exceptional delivery model for Through the Gate and ROTL work that CRCs have been doing. So in that, for those of you who don't know what an exceptional delivery model, it's really identifying what are the key things we need to do in this pandemic to make sure that services are provided and that we prioritise what services are provided. We went through the Gate specification that CRCs work to at the moment, and we pulled out what we thought were really the basic things that have to be done and that we can't avoid doing, and that it would be positively dangerous if we didn't do, and put them into this EDM, exceptional delivery model. The CRC signed up to this work really well, and what we then did is we created a Through the Gate recovery board to monitor the recovery of services against those EDMs. And also to monitor when we had to roll back some of those services. So we had, as you will all know, we had an improvement in delivery and more and more delivery from over the summer last year. And then, of course, some of that work had to then be rolled back again. So the Through the Gate Recovery Board looked at data that we received from all CRCs to work out what was happening out there in every prison, and to flag up whether things were being delivered against the specification in resettlement prisons and in non-resettlement prisons. And one of the things we also looked at was how much MPS are commissioning Through the Gate services in each non-resettlement prison, as a way of showing that that work was continuing or not, as the case may be. We've done some work as a result of some of that information. So where we've identified initial issues and problems in particular prisons, we have managed to go back to the prisons, talk to governors, talk to heads of reducing reoffending, talk to teams on the ground to try and help sort out some of those problems that couldn't be sorted out locally. And most of those things were sorted out locally, of course, but there were just some that we got involved in. And we also did things like fed up information to regional probation directors around things like the commissioning rates for the non-resettlement prisons. Once again, I just wanted to say how grateful I am as the Through the Gate lead and the lead for Through the Gate recovery for HMPPS for the work that people have done to contribute to that across the board. I'd like to now go over to Jeanette, who's going to talk a bit about the COVID emergency accommodation scheme and homelessness prevention task force.
Thanks, Fiona. That's great. Hello, everyone. I'm Jeanette Peters, and I'm based in the Reducing Reoffending Partnerships and Accommodation Directorate. Can I have the next slide, please? So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about one of the really positive things to come out of COVID, actually, which is the COVID emergency funding that we managed to secure and the development of our homelessness prevention. I've called them teams on this slide, so the phraseology is pretty interchangeable, really. They started out as task forces, but they've sort of morphed into teams, really. So I think, you know, it's no great secret, is it, that accommodation is really challenging for significant numbers of people leaving prison custody. And when we went into the first lockdown last year, MHCLG, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, set up a scheme which they called Everyone In, which was focused on making sure that rough sleepers had some temporary accommodation to go into immediately, with a focus on moving them on into something more settled. Now, from our perspective, that sort of supported people who were already out and potentially rough sleeping, but what it didn't do was particularly help with the people who will be kind of coming out through the gate in the next kind of all the coming weeks. And I think when we first started out, we didn't really know how long this would go on for. And I think a number of us thought it would be kind of months rather than a whole year. So the scheme has run in 2 phases. So the first scheme, as we think of it, was started in May and ran until August, in line with the restrictions that were in place at that time. And we secured a significant amount of money from Treasury, or permission to use a significant amount of money to be able to fund people into temporary accommodation for up to 56 nights. We then started to wind the scheme up, and then of course we went into a second national lockdown. So we sort of set back off again in October, and that second phase of the scheme has just started to kind of wind up now and stop taking referrals on the 9th of April. So the reason for that end date was very much in line with the government's roadmap to recovery. So Monday, the 12th of April was quite a significant date on that roadmap. So we, having got some money, we needed a mechanism to be able to place people and deliver. And so we initially set up 7 divisional homelessness prevention task forces, as they were called at the time. And the focus for those teams was to really act as a single referral point for all the kind of hotel and nightly let accommodation that we were able to put in place. So in scheme 1, we used a lot of hotel accommodation for quite a long time. And in scheme 2, we moved to much more sort of nightly let contracted accommodation and tried to keep people in hotels for less time. And I'll come on to some of the kind of lessons that we've learned in a minute. And the other thing that the HPTs have really been brilliant at doing is kind of making sure that there are strategic links with other local partners. Can I have the next slide, please? Next slide, please. Got a delay in the system, I think. Can you still hear me, everybody?
You're back now, yeah.
Have I disappeared for a second? Sorry.
You have a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Sorry, this is the joy of Teams, isn't it? So we asked the MOJ implementation unit to carry out a deep dive on the homelessness prevention teams, and we also conducted our own lessons learned. And what we've learned is, I suppose, first and foremost, that it's much needed, that the whole kind of space has been really positively and helpfully filled by the role of the homelessness prevention teams and the funding that we've had available to us. We've supported significant numbers of individuals The only reason I can't give you an exact figure is because all that MI's management information is just being cleansed at the moment, and that will be published in about early July in line with the community performance statistics. So but it is significant numbers, really. Everybody felt very passionately about the benefits that the services could provide, not only the people that worked in homelessness prevention teams, but also offender managers who have fed back that the kind of stress that they felt and the pressure they were under trying to find accommodation for people was hugely alleviated by the introduction of this service. And our partners, when we spoke to our partners outside, local authorities, PCCs, etc., police and crime commissioners, about how they felt or what they felt that the kind of the homelessness prevention teams had brought into this space, was that they all felt that it had really helped to promote collaborative and multidisciplinary working, and that's something we want to really see continue. I think it's not without it's not sort of a surprise, I suppose, that there were several cross-system issues that impacted on people's ability to deliver their objective. And the objective, of course, was to make sure that nobody left prison homeless if they didn't, make a decision to do that themselves. Some of those are so far outside of our control. So actual access to bricks and mortar is an issue, certainly in some parts of the country. There are issues around affordability, and for some of the nightly let accommodation that we use, certainly kind of really challenging to try and have something priced on a nightly rate and then for that to move into an assured short hold tenancy that someone can actually afford to stay in. So lots to learn in that space, really. Private landlords don't always, as you know, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, private landlords sometimes have views about our sort of the individuals in our care and what they will be like as a tenant, and so there's lots to do in that space as well. And local authorities built some amazing relationships with local authorities, but there are still issues in the system around duty to refer, and some local authorities describing people as intentionally homeless and refusing to accommodate them. So that's one of the reasons why, because HPTs have been so successful, they will be a feature of the future landscape, which is really positive news. And I will go on at the end of this session to just briefly update you on what some of that moves into. So can I have the next slide, please? So I'm not going to read all these out. And unless you're on the phone, I'll just give you an idea. I'll read out one or two. So it's service user and individual and offender manager quotes, and they are all in the vein of it's made a huge difference, and it's really helped people to bridge the gap between prison and settled accommodation. So finding somewhere to stay on that first night has proved to be really helpful, and we've certainly seen lots of people transition through the short-term accommodation that's on offer to them and then into something more settled, and people have really been able to kind of in a huge number of instances actually kind of find their feet and to access employment and other support, which is really, really positive. So all round a really big success story, and not possible without the kind of whole partnership piece that all of the HPTs have been heavily involved in. So that's it from me. So you're going to hear a bit more about how some of that works in practice now. So if I hand back to you, Fiona, I think we're going to hear from Doncaster in a second, aren't we?
We are, yes. So I hope the Doncaster team are standing by, because we'll need to have you coming on camera as soon as you can. They're coming on now. Without further ado, this is the first example of best practice that we've got for you. We'll let the team explain to you what happened, but I'll start by letting the team introduce themselves. So, Helen, starting with you, Helen.
Yeah, hello, my name's Helen Cotton and I'm from HMP Doncaster, and I'm the Head of Resettlement and Community Engagement.
And Charlotte?
Hi, I'm Charlotte Underwood. I work through the gate in Doncaster Prison.
And last but not least, obviously, Miriam.
Hi, I'm Miriam, and I am one of the resettlement advisors at HMP Doncaster.
And just to tell you, as a point of amusement, I managed to invite the wrong Miriam Khan to the original meeting. So there are two Miriam Khans in our system, but this is the right Miriam Khan, thankfully. Right, so just what I'll do is I'll go through and I'll ask you a few questions so that you can explain to me basically how what happened, and then give you a chance to reflect on what you think worked differently because of COVID, the benefits of partnerships, etc., and what you might do differently, what worked well, and all that sort of stuff, what you're going to keep in the future. So we're calling this service user, person in prison, and then outside of prison, Mr. X. So Charlotte, starting with you, how did you identify that Mr. X had accommodation needs?
We speak to all the service users within the first few days of the communist custody to carry out the basic custody screening. And we do this during the pandemic via the in-cell telephones, and when we can't get access to them via the in-cell telephones, we send paper questionnaires or go off the information that we have already for them. And we identified that Mr. X in this particular case was homeless when he came into custody and would be on release, so referred him straight through to our NACO team.
Brilliant. And then, so Miriam, you're in the NACRO team. What did you then do?
So as part of our job role, I referred Mr. X to the council via the legal duty to refer. And on top of that, I referred him to support accommodations within the area that he was returning to. We managed to get an assessment with a particular support accommodation provider, which resulted in that particular service user getting a space for his release. This was right up until the point we then found out 2 days before his release that he tested positive for COVID. And that then changed the plan for release.
And yeah, that threw a huge spanner in the works at a very short period before release. So thankfully, and this is where we really rely on prisons themselves and the prison structure where the prisoner is being held, to help support this. So going to Helen, what did the prison then do to help with this case?
Yeah, so we'd put a process in place at Doncaster Prison that we'd been communicating with healthcare. Healthcare had been publishing a daily list of any individual that had tested positive or was symptomatic and self-isolating. OMU staff were checking that list on a daily basis, and Mr. X came up as being on the list and due for release. So at that point, that sort of kick-started a number of processes, talking to a number of departments and a number of agencies in terms of letting them know that Mr. X was positive and that we needed to work with this case differently and provide as much support as we possibly could. So at that point, we, like Miriam said, it was only 2 or 3 days prior to his release. So the POM was notified, and the POM was in regular contact with the prisoner via the in-cell telephones. The enhanced through the gate team, as Charlotte, as the worker, was notified, so she could talk to the other partnerships about that. And also reception staff were notified in terms of how we could discharge the prisoner safely from protecting staff as well as other prisoners being discharged as well.
And on that point, did you actually use a different area then than your normal reception?
We did. So with discussions with reception staff, because we knew we had other prisoners being discharged and we'd got transfer of prisoners coming in on that day, we identified using the visits hall because visits were closed at that moment in time, and we had separate members of staff who went to the visits hall. We discharged through that area, and then we had a deep clean of the area afterwards as well. In addition to that, we also arranged for PECS transport. So we spoke to the prisoner. He consented to engaging with PECS transport, and that was also ordered up to 24 hours before I think we had to do that. And then the last thing that the prison were able to put in place was that we also provided a food parcel. We were well aware that Mr. X would have to self-isolate for another 3 days following release. So he wouldn't be able to go out. We knew that he got limited access to family and friends. So we provided a food parcel that he could take to the property.
That's fantastic, thank you. And I mean, I think it is a really good example of a real thoughtful wraparound care. You know, thinking about all these sort of potential issues with very short notice. I mean, you only had 48 hours to do this, really, didn't you? So you're all rushing about trying to get these things sorted. Charlotte, can you just say a bit more about what you did to make sure that once he was released, he was then supported in the community after release?
One of the things we arranged was for Mr. X to have a mobile phone.
Yeah.
We arranged for that to be placed in his property, as we couldn't see him face to face. We provided his community offender manager with the number. I spoke to substance misuse to check if he was on any methadone scripts, of which he wasn't, but we made sure that substance misuse had his contact number, and they arranged for the drug services in the community to call through to Mr. X once he'd been released, and checking with healthcare and making sure he had any medication that he needed as to go with as well.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. I think now we probably have a bit of a chance to reflect on what worked differently because of COVID and the benefits of partnerships. I mean, I think you've already touched on all of that. What I'm interested in is, you know, were there things that you learned from that experience and led you to do something differently? And what of those things that work well that you're going to keep? I think it would be worth coming to Helen first from a prison point of view. And we're going to bring up a slide shortly after she's talked through some of the linkage between the different departments.
Yes, I think we definitely learned a lot from the process. It was very time consuming for the first case because it was the first time we'd experienced this. But following this, we put together a flowchart process, and part of that process was to consider everything that might need to be thought about when working with a COVID positive release case, and also highlighting which departments or which head of would be responsibility for making sure that those actions were carried out. Just to say that since this time we have had another COVID positive release in the last couple of weeks. So we have used this process that's on screen. It helped us jump into motion much quicker, and for people to understand what their roles and responsibilities were within that. And we have learned lessons again from the latest release. Again, it was an individual who was identified as being of no fixed abode. Because it was the same local authority that we were working with, they were actually able to provide us with an address quicker because we'd gone through that process with them before. We'd also highlighted, so in addition to issuing the food parcel, we also issued a bedding pack and a toiletry pack because again it was an individual that needed to self-isolate for some days following release.
That's fantastic. And obviously this process map we can send out at the end of this. It's not part of the slide pack. We had real issues trying to get it onto PowerPoint, to be honest. But we can send it out if you're happy to share it, Helen, to others, because I'm sure there are those similar process maps have been put in place in different prisons, but it's definitely an example of good practice, I think, in terms of the way it lays out all the different scenarios and the things that you've got to think about. So and really good to hear that you've tested it out again and it worked and you've learned again from that next experience. So can I bring Charlotte in now from a through the gate point of view? Just anything that you might want to reflect on in terms of the linkage with the community services, because one of the things that, you know, we've been criticised before about in prison system is that prisons don't link very well with probation outside and other community services. So is there anything that you want to reflect on in that respect?
Absolutely, especially with the second COVID case we've had. Again, we've linked in community offender manager, let them know the mobile numbers. Speaking to Mr. X in the second case just to about smaller details, you know, what support do you have on release? We identified that he didn't have any clothing apart from the bare minimum, which he came in with, and no toiletries. So speaking with Helen, who kindly also arranged for him to be released with some clothing to see him through isolation. I then liaised with some of the agencies of the community to see what we could get for after his isolation period, speaking with his community offender manager to see if they knew of anything. We managed to get a grant for him, which came through in the form of e-vouchers from the local authority, which which the community offender manager was able to pass on to him after he'd finished isolating, so he could get some clothing and some more food as well, and also speak with other agencies that might have parcels that they could pass on to him, but also speaking to the service users, or Mr. X in this case, just checking how they are, how they're feeling about being released, letting them know that we're working on the case for them and keeping them reassured, and keeping in contact with the community offender manager and just feeding back on what we're doing and what's happening in the prison. So that worked well, and we got good feedback from the community offender manager after as well.
Oh, fantastic. I knew that would happen at some point, and I was kicking myself. It should not have been me putting myself on mute. I don't know whether other people were finding that Charlotte was stopping and starting. I'm really hoping it's just Charlotte's Wi-Fi. It wasn't mine as well, but anyway, we'll move on now to Miriam, who I'd be interested from you, Miriam, to describe from an accommodation specialist's point of view, you know, any challenges with working with the local authorities, anything around accommodation issues that you might want to raise?
So just like what Helen touched base on, this Mr. X was the first COVID case we've had since the pandemic begun. So local authorities themselves did advise that this individual was the first COVID person they've all come in contact with since COVID first started. So the initial stages of trying to get accommodation was quite difficult. We had 48 hours to search accommodation. So following on from that, the second COVID case we had, there was a lot more quicker response. Accommodation's always been a struggle, and COVID does not make that any easier. So when you've got somebody who's positive, ideally you do need a self-contained flat, and they're quite hard to come by anyway. So put COVID and a pandemic on top of that does not make it any easier. But on reflection on the second COVID case we had, I think there was a lot more of a smoother transition. And I think also they had a smoother transition of a move on. So it's all good placing Mr. X in isolation. He was going to be NFA if he came out. So the council were a lot more proactive in ensuring there was a stable move on plan for the service user. And that's where Charlotte sort of interacted with the community manager just to ensure that support would then be continued in the community.
That's fantastic. I do want to just see if anyone has any specific questions for the Doncaster team at this point, because I think you've covered what happened really well, hopefully, and you've covered really well what you think has changed and what your reflections are about it. And I just wondered, has anyone got any specific questions, or are you all absolutely happy with that? Or there may be questions that come up which you might just want to put in the chat. It's absolutely fine if that's the case. I'll just hang fire. Hang on, I'm just going to quickly look at the conversation to see if there's anything. No, there isn't. Well, can I thank you very much for that? That's been a really brilliant to listen to. Really good practice in terms of of Doncaster. It's really good to see the work that was then done afterwards, in terms of putting a process map together. So that's really, really good. And it sounds like other people are saying the same sort of thing. So you're getting some you're getting some positive feedback, I think, from the chat. So I'd like to go on now to talk a bit about perhaps when things didn't go quite so well. And I'm going to run through I'm not going to tell you which prisons were involved. Obviously, this is all going to be absolutely anonymous, but I will run through. If we could go to the slide on lessons learned, please. And I will run through some of the things that a particular issue came through for us. Right, there we are. Brilliant. I'm just going to quickly, I can't actually read that on the screen, so I'll do it on my own. So we're going to call this particular prisoner Mr. K. He was received into a large local prison last year. He spent significant periods in the segregation unit. He had language problems in terms of English was not his first language, and it looks like he had some mental health issues as well. The BCST1 in this particular case was not completed by interviewing him face to face, but it was completed on the 5th of December, and then it was remotely using the prisoner escort record and prison records. It was recorded as that he had permanent accommodation on the BCST1. However, this doesn't appear to have been verified with the prisoner at the time. And I think it was just taken from the records, possibly by what he said on reception. On the 11th of December, the BCST2 was completed, and it stated that Mr. K had an address to stay prior to custody and that he was living alone. It was clearly assumed that he could then return to that address. There were 2 other addresses being listed, but with no comment that no further action was required by the CRC. On Nomis, there were comments about the language barrier and it being difficult to engage with him because of his behavioural issues. On Endelius, it was recorded as he was NFA earlier in the year, but later in the year, just prior to custody, it was recorded that he had settled accommodation with friends and family, and there was an address recorded on Nomis. So it does look like there was very different information depending on what IT you were looking at for this person. Later, the BCST3, i.e. the review of the BCST2 was done. And this was on the 24th of the 12th, it says, Christmas Eve. He disclosed that he will be returning home, but he didn't disclose the full address. So 2 known addresses were recorded and no further action was felt to be required from the CLC at that stage. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the lessons learnt for the receiving prison. Really, I think what this shows us that we really probably always need to check something. I mean, obviously, normally a BCST1 should be completed with the prisoner to get a true and accurate assessment of the accommodation. But at least if you can't do a face-to-face assessment, try and confirm the information some other way, I guess. Resettlement staff were finding that they couldn't really accept the information on the BCST1 to be correct. Again, it was hard to engage with this particular person due to the language barrier, due to lots of the lack of face-to-face delivery, and the fact that he was located in the segregation unit, and there was incorrect assumptions that you'd returned to a previous recorded address. So I think it's clear that what's been said on the BCST1 has to be checked, and I feel like I'm stating the obvious to people who know this already. And again, we should be really careful not to make assumptions, particularly where there's a language issue. We should be using big word contract or any other contracts just to check people's understanding. So can we go on to the next stage, please? This case got more complicated. He was transferred via court late in January. So on the 25th of January, he went to court from the original reception prison. He went to court and then was sentenced and sent to another resettlement prison. On arrival at this second prison, he was dealt with as an inter-prison transfer and not as a new reception. So there was no involvement of the new through the gate team at that point. He also received a very short sentence, and so when he got there, he had a very short sentence. His date of release was actually initially calculated incorrectly, and 3 days later, I think it was, his date of release became apparent that it was actually that day and not the day after. What this meant was, of course, the prison itself, anyone else who was involved in his case, were running around trying to see what needed to be done, but only on the date of release. His NOMIS records still showed that he had a permanent home address. However, they discovered on that date of release that he didn't have a permanent address. The prison OMU contacted the community offender manager on the afternoon of the day of release, telling him that Mr. K was COVID positive and required accommodation. So the poor probation officer in the community was given no time at all to try and find accommodation. Not only had to find accommodation for somebody who had a significant language issue, but he was COVID positive. Can we go to the next slide, please? So there's really some clear lessons learned, I think, for the second receiving prison, which is, I mean, stating the obvious, sentence calculations need to be correct. It's particularly vital when it's a very short sentence because you don't have much time to check it. And that where there is a requirement for accommodation, it should be flagged up as soon as possible. OMU also need to give notice as early as they possibly can to the community offender managers of anyone who's COVID positive. Obviously, that means that the healthcare department has to give OMU as much information as quickly as possible, because that transfer of information can delay somebody's accommodation being organised and other significant care issues around that accommodation, which we've just heard from Doncaster was significant in terms of food parcels and clothing, etc. The other things that people need around, and a phone and all the other things. What we're not clear about is why the Through the Gate team at the new prison, I mean, they have specialist accommodation workers in that particular prison, wasn't involved by the OMU, and that it went straight to the com outside. So but that's been looked at by the prison. Could I have the next slide, please? So obviously seeking accommodation on the day of release is not ideal. The homelessness prevention team was contacted by the community offender manager and the local authority was contacted. They had a very short period of time to do this, obviously. But the local authority housing worker didn't seem to know what to do re COVID positive prisoner releases. And I go back to what Miriam said about that actually the first case they had at Doncaster was really quite tricky because people didn't know what to do. The second one was better because people had a more understanding of what you do in this particular circumstance. We thought this might indicate a lack of information amongst housing staff about COVID cells in local authorities. There are such things, and they should have really clear ideas of what accommodation can be offered, where that accommodation is, what's available on what day. So the local authority was actually requesting that the usual duty to refer process be carried out at that point. And everyone was going, hang on a minute, there's another way of doing this. The lack of a speedy response from the local authority housing worker to the community offender manager and to the homelessness prevention team meant that they were really stymied in terms of getting local authority support. They tried a emergency local authority line and weren't getting a response. So I suppose it's an issue. We can't assume that this is an issue for all local authorities, and it could just be that particular local authority or that particular individual. But it was definitely exacerbated. The whole issue was exacerbated by this very short period that they had to act. Could we have the next slide? At that point, we've clearly got we felt there were a few lessons learned that we could pass on to local authorities and to public health and prisons, for example. So we thought that the homelessness prevention teams and probation staff really need access to emergency numbers for local authorities that work. The last thing you want if you've got an hour to get somebody accommodation is to be ringing a number that's not been answered. MHCLG will be approached to request contact lists where these don't exist already. So it's worth, if you've not already done it, it's clearly worth making the links with local authorities, between prisons and local authorities, and making sure you've got the right numbers and and everybody's got that information. The National Probation Service heads of services were given a form of words to use with local authorities in terms of, in the future, re-referrals to COVID cells. So we hope that that might go a bit more smoothly in the future. And one of the things we picked up was that the prison, and it might just have been the duty governor on that night, that evening, didn't seem to know of a way to continue detention legitimately via a Public Health England direction to isolate. That obviously is for the English prisons. So we've talked about that to the individual prison, and they've raised awareness with their duty governors, but it might be that Prison Gold should do some more work around making sure that the governors know about the direction to isolate process. Could I have the next slide? We're going to, having thought about some lessons learned and some of the things that did go well and some of the things that didn't go well, I would like to go straight into a second example of good practice. I'm hoping that will cheer everyone up, given that we've just had a miserable example of where it didn't go very well. The prisoner ended up not getting the accommodation on his, his agreed date of release, and was actually detained illegitimately for a day after that, for the best of reasons and for the kindest of reasons, because what they didn't want to do was put somebody out onto the street who was COVID positive, and things got sorted the day after. But we'll go straight into Hewell, and I will start by thanking Dennis, Emma and Wendy for joining us and letting you introduce yourselves. So can we start with Wendy, please? Oh, she's on mute. I knew that was going to happen. Having said that, it was me that started that trend. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm Wendy. I was a housing officer for Warwickshire and West Mercia CRC based at HMP Hewell in Worcester. Thank you.
And then Dennis?
Yeah, Dennis Gregg, probation officer based in Hereford, dealing with a varied caseload.
That sounds like a trying to put a nice spin on that when you say varied. Yeah. And then Emma.
Hi, yeah, I'm Emma Faulkner. I'm non-operational. I work in business strategy and change as a contracts and partnerships lead. I was redeployed for a couple of months into the HPT last summer.
Thank you. And I hate the expression non-operational because it always makes someone sound like they don't do anything, but you're clearly not in that category. So we're calling this particular prisoner, who was in Hewell prison, Mr. M. And I'd like to start with Dennis because Dennis knew Mr. M before he even went in on this particular prison sentence. So, Dennis, over to you. Could you explain what you knew of him?
Okay, so I work with the National Probation Service, and as you all probably know, there's the Community Rehabilitation Company. Mr. M was with the CRC. There was a risk escalation, and he came to me. It was a domestic abuse matter, and it was escalated because the risk was rising. He'd gone back to his ex-wife, and the risk was going up. So he came over to me. I'd never met him before. He was in Telford, actually, as it happened, and I was in Hereford, which was the first little problem. But we made it quite clear to him, and we got the Telford probation people to go and visit him, that he was not to be with his ex-wife. He was supposed to be in a hotel in Telford because the COVID thing had only just started, and he was in a hotel in Telford. Visited, and he wasn't there. He was actually back with his ex-wife, and police were involved, one thing and another. So a bit of a no-brainer, really. I recalled him on his post-sentence supervision licence, which was all that he was on, and we managed to get that expedited and dealt with pretty quickly. And I managed to get him out of the community and into the prison as soon as I possibly could, and so that we could sort things out.
Thanks.
Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dennis. And that it shows this is quite a complicated case, because not only was he escalated from a CRC case to an MPS, he was then had to be recalled. So going on to Wendy, how did you identify that Mr. M, I don't know whether I'm calling him Mr. M or Mr. X here, but I think we're calling him Mr. M, had accommodation needs?
Yeah, so he was brought to our attention from the resettlement guys. They carried out his BCS2 to highlight the needs and the support that the service user needed. They put him on our spreadsheet, and that's how we picked him up. So I did the DTR to Hereford. Sorry, before that, because we don't have face-to-face contact with service users because of COVID. Luckily enough for us, Hewell had installed in-cell telephones, which has been an absolute godsend through this COVID 14 months on, or whatever we are. So I was able to phone him, see what his issues were, where he needed support. He said he'd got to go back to Hereford. I did the DTR to Hereford, and I also emailed Dave Wheeler, who's the head housing officer at Hereford Council. And then I emailed Dennis to explain what I'd done, told him what I'd done, and did he want me to set the ball in motion for HPT. So Dennis was, I had a great interaction with Dennis. We shared lots of information between us regarding Mr. M's risks and etc. And Dennis says, yeah, let's go for the HPT. So I filled in my parts. I pinged it back to Dennis to fill in the risk parts that he had to fill in. Then he sent it back to me, and I forwarded it on to the HPT task force. You're on mute.
I can't believe I've done that again. That's ridiculous. I think I probably did say to people, whatever you do, don't put yourself on mute. Anyway, so just to come to you, Emma, could you tell me what you did from an HPT point of view?
Yeah, sure. So after the referral came through from Wendy and it was passed on to me to be actioned, I realised that I only had 24 hours to find Mr. M suitable accommodation. So I contacted Redfern only to find that there was no hotel accommodation at all available in Hereford. And in fact, the nearest was Gloucestershire or Birmingham, which were completely unsuitable. And it really did look as though Mr. M would end up in a homeless shelter on release. I called Redfern back a couple more times and luckily spoke to an operator in the end I'd previously dealt with and built up a rapport. So I explained the situation to her and asked her if she could just think outside the box a bit and have a look for alternative options. Anyway, she came back with a B&B in Hereford, perfect. And she'd even already spoken with the landlady to walk her through the process because she hadn't had any experience of taking anybody who'd been in prison before. She was happy to accept Mr. M as a tenant. So I booked the accommodation for 2 weeks rather than the standard 1 week to give him a bit more of an opportunity to secure some more permanent accommodation, just to give him a bit of a chance, really.
Thank you. That's great, and that's I really like the idea that you were trying to, both you and Redfern person were trying to think outside the box, if you like. So going back to you, Dennis, then what happened? He was released. What did you do after Mr. M was released?
Okay, so he came to Hereford on the train. So I arranged to meet him at Hereford train station. And that was the first time we'd met face to face. And I then walked with him to the accommodation, which was on Aylstone Hill, so that he wouldn't get lost. And we had a good chat on the way, which was really rather good. And there we are. So took him to the accommodation. Had a word with the owner of the accommodation, and she was fine. It was a lovely place, actually. He was very pleased to be there. So there we are. So that's what happened then.
And that was a conversation that might have gone very much worse, given you were the person who'd recalled him and sent him to prison, in effect. But anyway, that's just a testament to your skills as a probation officer, no doubt. So just going back to Emma, did you have further involvement then from an HPT point of view?
Yes, because it turned out that the landlady was so taken with Mr. M, and he was, by all accounts, a bit of a model tenant. She offered him a tenancy in their self-contained attic flat. And she was actually delighted that she was able to help someone in need. And it had been a really positive experience for her. So the HPT were able to provide a deposit and a rent advance to help get Mr. M started, give him the best start that we could, really. Fantastic,
thank you. We've now got a bit of a chance to reflect on what worked differently because of COVID and the benefits of partnership. I think that has the benefits of partnerships between you all actually have really shone through that example. But yeah, could you think about what things you might want to do differently, what worked well that you will keep? I'll come to Wendy first as our through the gate representative. I know she's a specialist accommodation person, but she's a through the gate representative, and she's also very knowledgeable about prisons, given her background. So yes, what would you say from a through the gate point of view? And you're on mute because it's not just me that does that, clearly.
But my dog was barking, so I put it on mute, and I thought, oh, and I forgot to put it back on.
That's wise.
I think with housing service users, it's really difficult. It is really, really difficult to find them somewhere. So, and in certain areas, it's worse than others. And Hereford is notoriously a very difficult place to find somebody accommodation. So, it's important that you build up a good relationship with the housing providers. And COVID, with the HPT being introduced because of COVID, it was an absolute godsend. It helped so many service users out, and it was lovely knowing, you felt you'd achieved something by somebody was getting released from prison and they weren't going to be homeless, especially in the cold months. We had all the winter and all that. And I think as far as could we have done things better, I don't think so, really. I think because I think it's so important to have a good relationship with offender managers, as well as other parties, of course, but with the offender managers, you share so much information, you support and help each other. And when you work together closely and you're all singing from the same hymn sheet, you can move mountains sometimes with helping service users out and getting them accommodation, that sort of thing. So, and it was having the in-cell telephones has been absolutely fantastic, because we can't have face-to-face with them at the moment. So by being able to talk to the service users, you're still able to, even if it's over the phone, you're still able to try and alleviate their concerns and their anxieties, because their main anxiety is mainly accommodation, because so many get stuck in this trap of being homeless, and it's quite heartbreaking, really.
I think thank you very much for that, because I mean, I think that brought out a few things there, doesn't it, in terms of importance of good communication, partnership, working with the HPT and the COM, and things like new technology, in-cell technology. I've heard this over and over again, has been really helpful during the COVID period. So it's been brilliant how quick we've managed to get that sort of started to be rolled out across lots of prisons, and how helpful that's been. So Dennis, can I bring you in now from a comms point of view, just to think about what other things that you might want to reflect on from your perspective?
Well, I thought it was just a breath of fresh air, to be honest, from the minute that Wendy got involved and pedalled things along as quickly as possible in the right direction. I had a phone call from Andy Bourne from HPT, and he was great. And I just got the feeling, my word, why can't it all be can do rather than can't do? And everybody was really behind it and moved really quickly. Andy was just, so decisive, and it was just refreshing. It was really, really helpful. And thanks very much to everybody there. And that's about it, really. The other comment that I suppose I would make is that it is such a relief when you do get some support with housing, because to have somebody coming out homeless is an awful thing. And this man would have been street homeless had it not been for HPT. And if COVID hadn't have happened, he would have definitely been homeless. So I was very grateful indeed for that.
Thanks, Dennis. I think that's probably a really good introduction to bring, or a nudge to me to bring back Emma to say again from her perspective, what are things that have worked better, and what have you got from this example and from other examples like it?
Well, I think I'll echo everybody's comments. I think certainly on this occasion, the communication, everything worked so well. We were all working at a hectic pace as it was. Yeah. But I think the only thing that I'll take away from this is don't take no for an answer. Don't be afraid to push for a better outcome. It really can make all of the difference. I think it's just that hanging in there, and even if you get a few knockbacks, just keep going.
Thank you so much. And I think that is a really, I mean, I noticed there are a couple of questions that Jeanette's put in the chat. They might be things that we want to have a think about, or you might want to reply. Either any of the people who've presented the good practice examples, but anybody else who's on this meeting might want to reply to Jeanette, because there are things that we would like to know as we go from EDMs and into a recovered position, I suppose. So I think that's a really good opportunity just to have a quick comfort break. I thought that people might be getting to the point where they need to get another cup of tea or whatever. So I'm going to suggest that we reconvene at 3:15. So that gives you 10 minutes for anyone to rush to the loo if they necessarily need to. Okay, see you all then. Bye. And thank you from Hewell. Hello, everybody. Well, I'm really pleased. I worry sometimes that when we give people comfort breaks, that they all go off and can't be bothered to come back. But you've obviously come back, so I'm really pleased about that. What I did want to say is that I missed a slide prior to the end of just at the end of the Hewell presentation. I mean, I'm not going to go through them, but these were the comments that we got from Mr. M, who was absolutely, I mean, one of the main things, it's over the moon, delighted, relieved. There was a whole load of sort of gushing thanks for the work that was done by the Hewell team. So without further ado, though, I'm going to go over to Jeanette to talk to you a bit more about what's next for the homelessness prevention teams.
Thank you, Fiona. Can I have the next slide, please, Claire? Thank you. That's great. Yes, I think before I say this, I'm just going to pick up on a point that somebody's made in the conversation bar, if that's okay, Fiona, which is that, you know, somebody said, and I think we'd completely agree with this, that HPT was an amazing scheme, but placing people in hotels without access to kitchen facilities wasn't always the best. And I think we really, I just wanted to say we really recognise that, and that's why we learned such a lot from that first scheme. We set things up at, you know, pace wasn't the word for it really, it was at 90 miles an hour. And that's why, as Andrea said, we kind of tried to concentrate much more on nightly let accommodation. And the reason I raised that point, Fiona, is because it takes me very nicely into this slide, really, which is kind of what next. So what next for the world of accommodation and what next for the homelessness prevention team. So as you'll be aware, the scheme ran until the 9th of April, so it stopped taking new referrals now. And it's kind of managing the people on the scheme into kind of exit and recovery, so people can be supported up to the 26th of May in terms of moving on from something temporary and into something more settled. All of the homelessness prevention teams have moved into recovery and exit planning, and it was a very kind of quick and very rapid response to a public health and public protection need that COVID sort of, you know, the issues that COVID raised, kind of particularly in the first lockdown. And as I said earlier, we really didn't think we'd be going a year later. I think many of us had moments where we thought we're nearly at the end of this temporary scheme, and then it would sort of calm down, and then we would have another kind of lockdown and it would extend again. But we're trying to kind of learn from it and apply all of the learning. And one of the things that it's been hugely successful in doing is helping us to secure funding from the spending review 2021 to deliver what is known as the Community Accommodation Service Tier 3. So it looks a bit like the COVID Emergency Accommodation Scheme, but is for 12 weeks rather than, so 84 nights rather than 56 nights. And it's very much focused on first night accommodation or release from prison. And people will be supported to move on into settled accommodation. And MHCLG, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, have launched a bidding round for local authorities in not only the kind of areas, and I'll come back to the kind of 5 regions in just a second and make sure everyone's clear about where they are, but across other local authorities as well, to support what they describe as ex-offenders moving into private rented sector accommodation. So there becomes a much clearer pathway. And of course, all this will then work together with the commissioned services providers from the Commissioned Rehabilitative Services Framework, or the Denote framework as it was known, and other things going on in the landscape. So we really hoped that we would get a 3-year spending review settlement. No department got that, so it's a 1-year settlement, largely because of COVID. So we had enough funding to be able to run this scheme initially in 5 regions, and you may hear those in the future referred to as CAS Tier 3 or the Vanguards, all kind of words of that, or descriptions of that nature. But it's 5 regions, so it's Kent, Surrey and Sussex, the east of England, the northwest, Greater Manchester and Yorkshire and the Humber. And that was based on need, and that will allow us to support up to 3,000 individuals in the first instance. And then we're putting in a further spending review bid this year to roll it out to everywhere, and for it to be run hopefully on a longer than a 1-year basis. But this is a really brilliant opportunity to take something from the COVID scheme and think about how we apply that on a bigger and more permanent footprint. So what we've done with the homelessness prevention teams is they've moved to 12 regional HPTs now, so from the 7 divisional, and we've got funding resource secured from within the MPS for 12 months. So the staffing is there as it has been for 2021-22, and that will give all of them a focus on, so if you're in a Vanguard or one of the CAS Tier 3 regions, there's a focus on building relationships across the system, embedding duty to refer, really kind of driving the delivery of outcomes in relation to accommodation. And for Tier 3 areas, obviously the delivery of the actual scheme, which is kind of bricks and mortar related, and that competition has just gone, or is in the, it has just gone live and is out for competition as we speak. So we'll be able to update on that again at some point, and that should go live in July. So we're really delighted actually that we've managed to build something that becomes a feature of the future landscape. So thank you.
Handing directly over then to Claire, who's
Oh,
going to
sorry,
talk.
I was meant to do that, Fiona.
You
Wasn't
were, but
I
don't
was,
worry.
and I forgot. I'm sorry. I was thinking, oh, was I meant to do something? Yes, sorry. Sorry.
It was going so smoothly.
Well,
Until that moment.
Sorry, Claire.
It's okay. Apologies in advance. My signal is really dodgy today, so if I disappear, please just fill the gap, talk amongst yourselves, and hopefully I'll be back. So I really just wanted to do a little bit about the recovery programme. I joined the probation recovery programme last July, working with Fiona on Through the Gate, and it's been fascinating kind of seeing how resettlement has been delivered and Through the Gate services have been delivered throughout just kind of such a ridiculously difficult time. So we set up the work stream last year, as Fiona said at the beginning. We had an exceptional delivery model. We set up a board which we made sure had representatives from prisons, CRC, Through the Gate people, the probation service, and also contract management. We also made sure that we had the prison regime recovery team at that meeting, because it's really key that they kind of played a part in our recovery and were aware of what we were doing. Having them on board also gave us a route up to escalate issues that needed raising. We had representatives from the probation reform programme, and again, it's kind of, we're very conscious obviously that as recovery was happening, transition and reform is looming ever closer, and so it was really important to make sure that we had the join up, and we were, from the recovery workstream, able to work alongside the resettlement design team just to start to structure expectations about what day one might look like, because it's unlikely to look like the original model and the original plan. So it was really important to have them on board. Last autumn, we carried out a baselining exercise where we started to gather information about what everybody was delivering and what they were able to deliver and how they were able to deliver that. And you won't be surprised to hear that the majority of the information showed that while pretty much all of the CRCs had managed to agree safe systems of work, they were going into the prisons on a regular basis, even if that was on a rota basis, to keep the numbers down and to keep the social distancing in place. The restrictive regimes meant that they had really limited access to, not allowed to say service users, people in prison. So they had limited access face to face. In some prisons where they had in-cell telephony, that wasn't such an issue. They were able to dial into the cells, they were able to still talk to people. There were some things that they had to work around, like sharing cells and sharing information, and Through the Gate staff having access to a phone, because a lot of prisons, the only phone was in OMU and people were kind of queuing up to get access to it. So there was a lot of working, planning, arranging to make sure that they could do that. In a number of prisons, they didn't have in-cell telephony, so it was a case of putting questionnaires under the doors, trying to talk to prisoners through doors. Massively far from ideal, but I think it's a real pat on the back and a real kind of congratulations to the teams who still made that happen and still managed to deliver a service. As Fiona said, some of it we were able to move outside of the prison, so a number of prisons set up departure lounges, mobile phones were handed over outside prisons, and that sort of thing. As part of our role in the recovery work stream, we were also able to link in with the prison regime network and make sure that messages were getting passed to prisons about Through the Gate. So we initially, when prisons were starting to reopen after the first lockdown, we made sure that messages went out to governors to say, when you're restarting regimes, please take into account the Through the Gate teams, please make sure that you're factoring them into your prison readiness reports. As we moved into the second lockdown, we were able to get messages out there about cross-site working, because a number of prisons had said that they would not allow any cross-site working. So we had to kind of push the point that actually, you know, in some cases you're going to have to. We made exceptions where there were outbreaks. And again, Through the Gate staff made separate arrangements, and they did some work through dial-in through other sites. There are now only 5 prison sites that have declared outbreaks. So that's down from a peak of around 92. And that does mean that Through the Gate services are gradually starting to return to normal. More and more prisons are applying to return to stage 3. I think the majority are either in stage 3 now or in the process of seeking approval to retain to stage 3. So we're moving not just into another stage of recovery, we're also moving into a new phase for recovery, because obviously, as you all know, from the 25th, 26th of June, the way that resettlement is being delivered is changing. That means that the structures and the organisation and the framework we have in place to report against recovery will no longer be there. It won't be fit for purpose. We won't have CRCs, we won't have contract management doing the assurance, we won't have those networks. So we are now considering how we hand over the recovery work to the RPDs, the regional probation directors, and we're working with the resettlement design team along with the RPDs to put in place an effective new framework. We hope, maybe, possibly, that from the 21st of June, if government restrictions are lifted, social distancing is lifted, you know, that will mean that we can move potentially away from EDMs and start moving back to some kind of new normal. I don't know whether face masks will still be needed. I don't know whether social distancing will still be needed. There's work underway at the moment where the recovery programs in both prisons and probation are looking at what the impact of lifting restrictions might mean, and that will include consulting obviously with trade unions and with staff, and seeing what feels comfortable, what feels right, and what feels safe. I think throughout all of the recovery, priority has been around ensuring the safety of both staff and people in prison and on probation, and that will continue. So part of the review that we're going to be doing now is also looking at how we bring the work that we've been doing in recovery and really properly align it with the work of the resettlement design team, so that we're not just doing that kind of short spell of between now and when the recovery programme winds up assurance, but we're also putting in place a structure that might be able to give us assurance around the new model and the new resettlement approach. So we're working with the design team on that at the moment. which I think probably, unless anyone has got any questions about recovery, hands me over neatly to the design team. Anyone got any questions?
I thought that was a perfect bit of segueing, that was. If I think that's the word that we use in our business. So over to you, Tony. If people do have any recovery specific questions, either on the wider probation recovery programme and specifically for Through the Gate recovery and then resettlement recovery going forward, feel free to put it in the meeting chat or flag it up directly with us later. That's fine, but we're happy to, or we can take those questions verbally as well at the Q&A point. Over to you, Tony. Tell us a bit more about what's happening in terms of resettlement design going forward.
Okay, thank you very much, Fiona. Yeah, I thought that the best thing to do is just give you a little bit of a background to myself, who I am, where I came from, what I've been involved in, what my experience is. So I'm Tony Laws. My background is I used to work very closely with Fiona. I was Fiona's deputy under Enhanced TTG. And I was also part of the team that implemented TTG under the Transforming Rehabilitation. So I've been there since the start, and I've seen a lot of the improvements that I brought on board during the Enhanced TTG. I'm a prison governor, predominantly working up in the northeast of England. And I myself was put back into an operational role in April of last year due to COVID. And I spent a wonderful 4 months up in HMP Default, up in County Durham. And what that allowed me to do was identify the work that was going on within the prison. It allowed me to talk to the prison staff. It allowed me to talk to the men that are located in there as well. And more importantly, it allowed me to look at the new ways that the TTG teams were ensuring that engagement with the men. But it allowed me to understand the importance and the relationship that the TTG teams had with the men. And the way that they had a reliance upon you to support them with that immediate needs assessment as well as their pre-release activity. So for me, it's very, very much a reflection on looking at the way in which the resettlement design was then developed. So very quickly, going back 18 months ago, when we hit business as usual with the Enhanced TTG, I then moved across into the design team within Probation Reform Programme. And I came in as a specialist within ATTG, within prisons, and an understanding of the CRC contracts. So that was a really good opportunity for me to get involved in that team, look at the model at that time, and then start helping to develop and sculpt and mould some of the different key components of that resettlement approach in moving forward. So fast forward, teams split out during COVID. Some probation team went back into local delivery units, delivering probation services, and myself and another back into prisons. We came back on board in September. Really good opportunity to sit down and talk about the innovation that we've seen, the bringing on board of purple visits, the utilisation of iPads, the way in which the TTG teams were engaging with men with NSIL telephony, letters. You know, there was some really good innovation going on out there. So for me, very, very important that when we then started developing the target operating model and then started to develop the operational approach to resettlement, the future model, that we harnessed this and we brought that on board. So very, very important for me, just to emphasise today that our approach to resettlement, that's intended to address any of those issues that were brought forward by HMIP reports on resettlement through the gate services. And what we've done is we've took out some of that best practice, and that's best practice delivered by you guys on the front, picked up by HMIP, and that's that best practice in that working with third partner organisations, that best practice of working directly with the prison teams as well. So a very much of an holistic working approach, and that's something which we needed to harness taking that forward. However, what we also understood was there was a lot going on with other change programs across the wider HMPS field and probation field. So that was a reconfiguration within some of the prisons, the impact that will have with the offender flows, somewhere that at the moment takes from courts, in the future might not take from courts. So we needed to start looking at saying, where's the best place to actually place those staff? How is the best approach to be taken to ensure that service is being delivered to the people at the right time and is very, very effective? So what we then done was we looked and we started to revise that resettlement approach. So it was taken on board the improvements that we're seeing for so far. And it was looking at the best way that we could bring that together and provide that pre-release activities for those individuals, whatever prison they're located in, and it provides them with that further support to try and support them with desistance. So I think very, very important to note that when we then went forward and looked at the importance of those TTG staff, one of the first things that we said throughout all of this was we need to continue with those enhanced TTG staff delivering that probation service. We need those staff to deliver the expertise, the knowledge, the relationships, everything that are built up. You guys are the professionals, and we needed that in moving forward. So what we devised was a role assignment process, which looked at those TTG staff, it looked at what the staff were doing, and we then made a decision that anybody who was delivering more than 50% of their time with sentence management responsibilities, so the likes of developing sentence planning, basic custody screening tool, we would transfer those into the probation service moving forward. People who were doing less than 50% or more towards what we would call the commission rehabilitative services, the likes of some accommodation services, if they were a professional, then they would move across into the commission rehabilitative services. I've got a bit more information on that in a moment. But I'm glad to say that based on the TTG staff numbers that we have, 77% of the TTG staff delivering the service have been transferred across into the probation service, and I think that is quite an accolade. And at the moment, the data is telling me there's between 650 and 700 of the current TTG staff will be moving across into the sentence management part of probation services from day one, 26th of June, delivering that enhanced through the gate service. Very important to stress that. So when we then started looking at the design of the resettlement approach, we came across 5 features. Now, the 5 features harness, take on board the importance of that excellent work that the TTG teams are delivering in each of our resettlement prisons and also within our non-resettlement prisons. So we came up with 5 features. Now, the first feature, that's levelling up with the work that the offender management in custody teams are delivering at the moment. And we understand that relationship between key workers, prison offender managers, community offender managers and ATTG staff. So what we've done was looking at saying, how can we bring that together and start developing the key components within OMIC and in effect bringing that 12-week process that we have for TTG service users at the moment to level up to that of high risk, which is 7.5 months. So it's bringing the handover to 7.5 months. Now, important to say, that's not day one requirement. That is something that can only be achieved when we start recruiting more staff. So this is something which we brought on board probably in a year's time when we do actually have enough staff to deliver that. But I just thought really important to mention that relationship that TTG staff have with those offender management staff working in custody. So it's a kind of an holistic together approach that we would like to harness in taking that forward. The second part is what we're calling a short sentence function. Now, predominantly the short sentence function, that will be working with those people who are sentenced to or have 10 months remaining in custody, so in effect 20-month sentence, and that provides a specific direct support service to that cohort. So in effect, there'll be a dedicated team working in those resettlement prisons. They can pick up that specific individual support, the immediate resettlement needs, and also pre-release planning. So a short sentence function, dedicated team in the prison working specifically with those short sentence offenders, those revolving door offenders. very, very much picking up on the importance of the work that you guys do, and some of that wonderful, wonderful work that you've got across the country in those different prisons. So that is something very, very important to note. Without the work that TTG teams have been doing, we wouldn't have really picked up on that. We wouldn't have been able to develop that further. And it's through some close interaction that we have with our TTG teams that we've been able to discuss this and mould it into what our approach will be for those short sentence prisoners. The next one, digital solution. The digital solution will continue delivering basic custody screening, and that will be something that will continue from day one. That will be replaced by a new digital solution. Now, the idea behind this is we're aware that there's several different digital solutions being used by different partnership organisations. The idea being that we will have one fully integrated solution that will allow everybody to see the different kind of information that's being inputted by different partner organisations. So it's a one-stop shop, in effect, that will allow you to see everything that's going on, build up a better picture, a better understanding in one place, and that will help as you start moving towards sentence planning. Now, from day one, we introduced something as well, which is a refer and monitoring system. Now, this links in with the Commission Rehabilitative Services. So in effect, the refer and monitor is a system, a digital system, a very user-friendly digital system, which allows a TTG staff in consultation with that person's community offender manager to actually log in and tick a box to say this person, through the sentence planning activity, immediate needs, resettlement needs, is identified, for example, an accommodation issue. That will then prompt an accommodation provider who will be working in the prison, I'll give you a bit more information on that in a moment, to then link up with that service user and start discussing what their specific needs are and how they can help them in addressing those needs pre-release as well as in the community. So that refer and monitor system will be available from day one, the 26th of June, and that will allow the ability for TTG staff and the community offender managers to link in directly. So I guess the way we look at it is Amazon Marketplace, probably the wrong way of trying to describe it, but an Amazon Marketplace where you can go in and you can purchase resettlement interventions that will be available from day one. We also introduce the commissioned rehabilitative services. And in effect, they are resettlement pathway activities provided by a private provider who will be linking in directly with that probation region. So one of the things I want to emphasise here in particular is accommodation and mentoring. Accommodation and mentoring will be available from day one. They will be available pre-release in custody as well. At the moment, we have a team of mobilisation managers working across the prisons estate and working directly with the probation regions. Those mobilisation managers are discussing about the placement, the embedding of those accommodation staff in that custodial setting, working alongside the TTG staff. So very important to emphasise working alongside. Now, those staff working within prison, they can then have that referral via that refer and monitoring system. Now, just to give you an overall kind of understanding of the accommodation specification as well, and this provides a range of approaches, which includes that direct delivery of interventions, support and advocacy, advice and guidance. Now, we're fully aware that those interventions need to be tailored to reflect the complexity of each individual, and they should aim to secure one or more of the following three objectives. So the first one, the outcomes. So the first one is service users obtaining or maintaining suitable accommodation. Second one, overcome barriers to obtaining, maintaining suitable accommodation and prevented from becoming homeless. Really good opportunity here for these accommodation providers to work holistically with that person, identify those needs and then provide those specific support interventions to help that person pre-release and in the community as well. So quite a lot of linking kind of going on within the accommodation arena with that at the moment. Very important to note as well that the fifth part of our features is a resettlement pack. Now the resettlement packs, these were took on board simply because of what you guys had developed in each of your areas under COVID. We understood the importance of those resettlement packs. So this was a lesson that we took out of the prisons and through engagement with TTG teams as well. And we've harnessed the packs that you've been using, those release discharge packs, and we're working very, very closely with probation regions at the moment to ensure that they continue as well moving forward. They are packs which can be given to everybody, and importantly, unconvicted, those people who might get released from custody later on in an evening, and who might not necessarily have received any specific support in the past. And likewise, moving forward, people who might be released directly from court as well. So it's emphasising exactly what you guys have done, replicating that, and we would not have been able to do that without that wonderful practice that you guys have been delivering throughout the whole of COVID. So a big, big thank you for that. Now, I think finally, what I'd just like to mention as well is based around those 5 features of the resettlement approach. We are utilising something that we call a fixed, flexible and free delivery approach. Quite an important thing here, because the national model, so this is based on the fixed approach, these are key components. These are models of excellence that we've extracted from the TTG contracts. It's models of excellence that we've taken from each of the regions with some really good examples of best practice. And what we've done is we've put that into a fixed approach that basically says to each of the regions, you need to continue doing this. Now, in addition to that, we have something called flexible, and that flexible is something which regional probation directors in consultation with the national probation reform team, we can determine the approach and the timescales in consultation with stakeholders. So it's starting to then harness that accountability, that support, and that relevance of all of the different stakeholders across that wider custodial and community setting as well. This starts then building up a bigger kind of network and a bigger understanding of the different support that we can offer to people. And then we'll move into something that we're calling the local, and this is free. This is the free thing. So this is when we then start drilling down into those local requirements. Now that is entirely at regional probation directors and governor's discretion to action. And that brings on board the likes of resettlement discharge boards and departure lounges. We continue with those models of excellence moving forward. It talks about the link in with critical care interventions teams. It talks about mental health team partnerships. It talks about the partnership approaches that you guys fundamentally been utilising and taking that forward, harnessing that and taking that forward. And then more than anything, harnesses on that excellent stakeholder and partnership working that you've been utilising since the contracts went live. Okay, thank you very much, Fiona.
Thank you very much, Tony. I think what we can take from that is if people have got any further queries about the resettlement design, that they can be referred to the resettlement design team. Tony's part of that. In the last Through the Gate newsletter, we gave links for the resettlement design team, links for each prison, so that people knew that if you're in Doncaster prison, the person that you contact it might well be Tony, actually, is it?
Yes, you've actually got me in the East Midlands and the North East.
Oh, well, there you go. Yeah. So that's been really helpful, but it is worth saying that if you have got further questions that you haven't thought about now, please, follow us up with those links and do it through us. If it's certainly through me, if you want to be put in touch with the right person in the resettlement team. Well, we're looking at the chat. What I haven't seen are a great deal of questions yet in the chat, although I have just seen a message from Helen, who's saying she's got a number of questions about the resettlement design, so she's going to get in touch outside. I know there's been a few comments about HPT funding going forward and what that might look like, and obviously Jeanette has talked about that a bit. And also about what's ideal in terms of emergency accommodation, how that, hotels are not ideal. If you can use a contracted facility, it's much better. And we've learned that as one of the lessons that we've learned throughout the pandemic. What I would like to do, because I'm conscious there may be people on phones that might want to ask questions. So I'm just going to open it up to and there may be people who want to make verbal questions on the Teams meeting as well. So please feel free to ask any questions now. Don't feel you have to ask questions either, because there may be things that you think about later and you want to contact us directly about, and in which case please feel free to contact me and I will send them to the right people within the group of people that have spoken today to answer. But let's just see if there are any further questions. No? Does sound very quiet. Thank you very much for that, Andrea. Nice bit of nice comment. Well, I think that it probably does mean that we can have 10 minutes back in our lives. That's an expression you probably all heard on Teams meetings. Craig has got a bit of feedback and has said it's been an excellent event. Thank you so much for that, Craig and Andrea. And it is, I think, I've just seen from Lucy that she's saying that it's useful to have time to reflect. And I think it is useful to have time to reflect. I think there may be things that you reflect on after this that you want to comment on. And please, like I say, feel free to do so. Can I thank every single one of the participants in terms of presenters today? I've learnt a huge amount by working with both the Hewell team and the Doncaster team about the challenges and the opportunities that actually they've faced during the COVID crisis. And I'm really, really grateful to everybody who's attended this event today, because it's been really good to share some of that learning with you. So thanks a lot, everyone. Very good to see you all.
Thank
Bye.
you. Take care all.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye, Fiona.